From the University of Notre Dame, I'm Brendan O'Shaughnessy, and these are Notre Dame Stories. Jimmy Gurulé teaches criminal law at the Notre Dame Law School. In July, a story that Gurulé was involved with more than 30 years ago was back in the news. Mexican authorities caught Rafael Caro Quintero, a leader of the Guadalajara drug cartel in the 1980s. Gurulé had indicted Caro Quintero and tried several related cases when he was a prosecutor in Los Angeles before coming to Notre Dame. We sat down with him to learn more about the story. Okay, all right, so we'll start with the first question. When and how did you learn the news that Rafael Caro Quintero was captured again?
On my cell phone, I get alerts with respect to New York Times articles, and so I was actually at a social event, and I got this alert on my cell phone, and I checked it out, and it was a New York Times article that stated that Rafael Caro Quintero had been arrested in Mexico and was in Mexican custody.
So tell us, who is Caro Quintero, and why was there a $20 million reward?
Yeah, Rafael Caro Quintero was the head of a very notorious, violent, and very successful and profitable drug cartel that operated in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. And he was responsible for ordering and directing the kidnapping and the torture murder of a DEA agent in Mexico by the name of Enrique Camarena.
Well, how were you involved when Caro Quintero was first indicted?
Well, I was working at the time as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles. I worked there from 1985 to 1989. Shortly after joining the U.S. Attorney's Office, this case was brought to my attention. Enrique Camarena was kidnapped in Mexico in February of 1985, and it was shortly after that I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the case was brought to my attention, and I was asked to conduct the investigation into the kidnapping and murder.
So tell us how that investigation went and kind of what went forward in terms of the indictment of Caro Quintero.
Well, it started focusing on an individual by the name of Jesus Felix Gutierrez, and Jesus Felix operated a business in Los Angeles. It was called Ocean Gold, and it was a seafood business, but it was being used as a front to launder money for the drug cartel. And so that was the Los Angeles link. You know, the kidnapping of DEA agent Camarena occurred in Mexico. The murder of Camarena occurred in Mexico. And so one of the interesting questions, well, why did the U.S. have jurisdiction, and why specifically did the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles have jurisdiction or a nexus, to this case? And it was really through Jesus Felix Gutierrez. And Jesus Felix Gutierrez, in addition to his work as a money launderer for the cartel, he was responsible for assisting Caro Quintero in fleeing from Mexico after the abduction and kidnapping murder of Camarena, and having him transported to San Jose, Costa Rica, where he eventually was arrested and then returned to Mexico for prosecution.
Were you ever able to prosecute Caro Quintero, or what happened with that?
We indicted him. I headed up the investigation for 3 years. It was a very lengthy investigation, a very complicated investigation, largely because, again, the crime was committed in a foreign country. The evidence was in a foreign country. The witnesses were located in a foreign country. And so it was a very unusual, case in that regard. So I headed up, I was the lead prosecutor heading up the investigation for 3 years. And ultimately, we indicted, and this was through a federal grand jury that I was using to investigate the case, and a federal grand jury indicted Rafael Caro Quintero. The U.S. Attorney's Office had sought to have him extradited from Mexico to the United States based on an outstanding arrest warrant for Caro Quintero. The Mexican government refused to turn him over. So we had the indictment, we had the arrest warrant, but we didn't have the body to prosecute him in Los Angeles.
Yet there still were trials.
Yeah, he was prosecuted in Mexico. My recollection is that he was not prosecuted directly for the murder of Enrique Camarena, but instead for drug charges. And he received a lengthy sentence, was incarcerated for a number of years, and then I think it was approximately in 2013 that he was released from prison based on a decision by a Mexican court that found some technicality that in their opinion justified releasing him from prison. And the Mexican Supreme Court overturned that lower court decision, found that it was erroneous, that Rafael should never have been released from prison, and then it was just again in July of 2022 that he was recaptured and rearrested after that period of from 2013 to 2022 where he was on the run.
And while Caro Quintero was not prosecuted in the U.S., there were U.S. trials that you prosecuted.
Yeah, I headed up, along with the co-counsel, we prosecuted 3 individuals that were members of the Guadalajara drug cartel, and all 3 of them were convicted of all charges, including Jesus Felix Gutierrez, the individual that had the connection to Los Angeles through this business Ocean Gold. And then Rene Verdugo was one of the other defendants, and he was a chief lieutenant in the drug cartel. We prosecuted him and then one other individual.
Tell me about the political implications, especially in Mexico.
Yeah, it was a very, very sensitive case because the indictment that I was able to obtain from the federal grand jury included several high-level Mexican government law enforcement officials, and they were implicated in working for the drug cartel, being on the payroll of the drug cartel. This obviously was very embarrassing to the Mexican government. It really strained relations, diplomatic relations, between the U.S. government and the Mexican government.
Why was Caro Quintero a problem in U.S.-Mexico relations?
Well, mainly because, again, he was responsible for kidnapping and directing the torture murder of a DEA agent. And DEA committed after that they were going to do everything in their power to bring to justice every individual that was responsible for Enrique Camarena's murder. And so that resulted in the DEA, federal law enforcement, intensifying their resources, investigations involving the drug cartel, and that placed a lot of pressure on the drug cartel. Again, there were high-level government officials that were on the payroll of the drug cartel, so they were at jeopardy of being indicted, apprehended, and arrested as well. So it really did strain diplomatic relations between the two countries, and continues to do so even to this day.
What do you expect will happen this time?
I'm not particularly optimistic that the Mexican government is going to turn over or grant an extradition request from the United States to extradite Caro Quintero for prosecution in the United States. I suspect that he may be incarcerated again based upon the original drug charges that resulted in his incarceration. But I think that because of the friction between the two governments here involving this case and the embarrassment that it's caused the Mexican government, I don't think they want to be perceived as maybe kowtowing to the U.S. government or having the U.S. government dictate to them what they should do with respect to their nationals that have been allegedly involved in criminal activities. So it's certainly possible that he could be turned over to the United States for prosecution, but I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen.
And you experienced the complexity of this U.S.-Mexico relations element yourself when you had to have several meetings to get clearance to indict.
Yeah, well, it was an interesting case. I mean, typically the U.S. attorney in a U.S. attorney's office pretty much operates as these offices operate as satellite offices, that they're pretty much independent, largely independent offices. And it's very seldom the case that the U.S. attorney has to obtain approval from the Attorney General of the United States to indict a particular case. This was one of those rare exceptions. I had to travel along with the actual U.S. attorney to Washington, D.C. on 2 different occasions in an effort to persuade the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, to give us permission, the authority to indict the individuals that were responsible for Enrique Camarena's murder, including some high-level Mexican law enforcement officials.
Do you think that the Netflix series, Narcos, about Kiki Camarena, do you think that that played a role in bringing this case back to the fore?
I think it did. You know, there's no question about it. I think that particular Netflix series was watched, had a very large audience of viewers. I think it highlighted the level of government public corruption with respect to drug trafficking, drug cartels, and the story itself is a very shocking story. It's a very Camarena is a very sympathetic figure. He was he was kind of a hero of sorts. He was very charismatic. He was an attractive young man. He was maybe somewhat idealistic in terms of the impact that he thought he could have on reducing the drug trade in Mexico. And then the fact that he was abducted and again murdered in the very violent, brutal way that he was really made him a kind of a symbol for the DEA, and all of that was highlighted in the Netflix Narcos Mexico series.
What do you think of U.S. actions when they abducted the doctor involved in the torture case, Humberto Machain?
Yeah, Humberto Alvarez Machain was a doctor, actually a physician, a medical doctor, and he worked for the drug cartel and the Guadalajara drug cartel, and he was often called on if there were injuries that resulted from violent confrontations between members of this drug cartel and other drug cartels, and in this particular case, he was called on to revive Enrique Camarena when he had been tortured to such an extent that he became unconscious, and so Dr. Machain was called to revive him, to keep him alive, so that he could be tortured and interrogated further. And the purpose of the interrogation was to determine if there were cooperating informants, individuals that were cooperating with the DEA that were working with the drug cartel, because Enrique Camarena was responsible for identifying a vast marijuana cultivation operation. There were thousands and thousands of acres of marijuana that was being cultivated in the open, and that marijuana field was ultimately destroyed. And it resulted in a multi-billion-dollar loss to the drug cartel. And so the drug cartel, Rafael Caro Quintero specifically, wanted to learn, well, how did that happen? Was there somebody on the inside that tipped off the DEA? And so Camarena was abducted for that purpose and interrogated for the purpose of eliciting information that would help the drug cartel identify any informants that were working for the DEA.
As leader of the wrongful conviction clinic here at Notre Dame, what do you think of some of the cases that have been overturned?
Well, there's been 2 cases, Camarena-related cases that were overturned based upon expert testimony that was offered at separate trials. I mean, there have been multiple Camarena-related trials. I was responsible for overseeing the indictment, the prosecution of the first Camarena trial that involved 3 defendants. And Rene Verdugo, one of the defendants, his conviction related to the kidnapping murder was overturned based upon expert testimony related to the analysis of hair exemplars that were found at the scene of the crime and that were compared to Verdugo's hair. And the development of technology in this field, again, 20 years later, has determined that the kind of testimony that was offered at trial then could not be supported by the technology as it has advanced, today. And therefore, his conviction was overturned. There was one other individual, Juan Mata Ballesteros, who was convicted in a subsequent Camarena-related trial. I had actually prosecuted him when I was a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles in a separate drug-related prosecution. Didn't implicate him in the Camarena murder. This was just a straight drug trial. And so he received a very lengthy sentence for the drug conviction and has served most of that sentence. So I don't think it affected him in terms of the amount of time served, because he was serving a sentence on both cases, the drug case and the Camarena-related case.
Okay, and do all of these allegations make prosecuting a 35-year-old case difficult?
It makes it almost impossible. So that's the other kind of interesting issue. So if the Mexican government agreed to extradite Rafael Caro Quintero to the United States to stand trial for his involvement in the Camarena murder, it would be difficult today to reconstruct all of that evidence and witnesses and to get them to testify. What would probably happen is that there would be an attempt to use the trial transcripts of the earlier trials and introduce the trial transcripts of those proceedings, of the trial proceedings, at this new trial. But because those specific trials did not focus on Caro Quintero specifically, it might not be sufficient, might not be adequate to justify his conviction.
All right. Anything you'd like to add?
I think the other interesting aspect of this is that how this case, even, it would be literally, he was abducted, Camarena was abducted in 1985, and here we are in 2022, and this case is still a sore point between the Mexican government and the United States. 30 years later, it is still a sore point between the two governments. And DEA's mission, their intensity, their focus on this case and wanting to bring to justice everyone responsible for the killing of DEA agent Camarena is probably as intense today as it was, 30 plus years ago.
Our thanks to Notre Dame law professor Jimmy Gurulé. Notre Dame Stories is produced by the Office of Public Affairs and Communications. I'm your host, Brendan O'Shaughnessy. Our music is by Alex Mansour.